Medicine has long been a bugaboo for the media. While medical studies might make for great copy, critics say most of those headlines are ill-informed and mislead the public on how clinical research actually works. A story from this week is a case in point. A cure for cancer? Israeli scientists say they think they found one. That stupendous headline in the Jerusalem Post got picked up by the wires and rocketed into publications around the world, including our own local news.
Israeli scientists say they'll likely develop a cure for cancer within the next year.
But hold the presses. The New York Times, Washington Post, and other major publications largely passed on the story. And here's why. In this interview on Israeli TV, the scientist offered this mammoth caveat.
So far, we tested it on mice. Next stage would be big animals and then humans.
So no humans have been tested at this point?
Not yet.
Okay, but when might this miracle drug be available?
When you say available, it's complicated because, it takes between 7 and 10 years to approve a drug.
In other words, it's not a story. I found this shocking because I saw it right away. It popped up on a Twitter feed, and then I started digging deeper into it, and I said, wait a second. I looked at that interview with the guy, and I said, this is nothing. And yet, dozens and dozens of newspapers picked it up, and this whole notion that it's going to happen within a year, and then he says we're 10 years away from even developing the drug.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the state of health and science reporting is pretty abysmal, and this is another example of that. I thought it was interesting that we were reading a Fox News story about this. They actually put in the appropriate caveats, and the others that we looked at didn't. So good for Fox News.
And it's so cruel of anyone involved in giving premature exposure to sketchy stories like this. Is there a household in our country that hasn't been touched by cancer? To offer false hope to people doesn't get much worse.
It was actually a public relations coup for the company.
Yes, it was.
Because most of the articles read like they just copied the press release.
No, it was totally they copied the press release.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. And Fox did interview an American scientist who said he was highly skeptical, and that was good to include that. But most of them shouldn't have run with it at all.
So lazy.
Well, the Jerusalem Post really started it, and they have a fairly decent reputation.
Yeah, not what it used to be.
Well,
I also think that this boomerangs on the scientists involved. It obviously rocketed to fame very quickly, and then you scratch at it a little bit, and it becomes clear that there's really, as Emily said, there's not a story there. And this gentleman who's now saying that, oh yeah, we'll have a cure for cancer maybe within a year, has been now internationally quoted as saying as much, and it almost brings a lot of his other research into greater skepticism. There's a lot of stuff out there in all sectors of science where there are studies that come out and are disproved, but most of those things are happen and are forgotten by the average person. This is a very high-profile example of something that gets a lot of publicity and then gets dialed back almost immediately.
I'm just surprised that so many organizations picked it up without their own verification or without interviewing the guy for themselves, with no caveats.
Yeah, that was surprising, and it's especially surprising because the state of science reporting has been so criticized in recent years. You'd think that journalists would be a little bit more on their guard and say, we don't want to make the mistakes that we've been making for the last 10 or 15 years.
But I do think with shrinking budgets nowadays, people just rewrite press releases and at best find somebody they can get on record to contradict the press release for an alternate perspective. But there's a staffing shortage.
If you're doing that, you've got to get out of the business immediately. I mean, this was real fake news.
Yes,
Ugly, nasty.
This next thing was not.
People need to get out of the business.
I agree.